on such an important and exciting and a bit disturbing topic. My name is Johanna Sumiala. I'm an associate professor here at the University of Helsinki in Media and Communication Studies, and I'll be hosting this event here. This is Professor Couldry's talk. Is part of the Faculty of Social Sciences 75th anniversary celebration. So we are very pleased to be celebrating and having Professor Couldry to celebrate with us this on this special year here. As a practical announcement, this talk is streamed, and it will be, there's a moment when we'll cut streaming, but then we'll continue. And basically, Professor Couldry is going to give a talk about an hour, and then we'll have Associate Professor Katja Valaskivi giving her comments, and then we'll open the floor for discussion and comments. So once again, very warm welcome to all of you, and then I would like to give a proper introduction. So Professor Nick Couldry is a professor of Media and Communications and Social Theory and in Department of Media and Communications at the London School of Economics and Political Science. He's also, since 2017, has been a faculty associate at Harvard Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society. And in fall 2018, he was also a visiting professor at MIT. Professor Couldry is the author or editor of 14 books, including The Mediated Construction of Social Reality, together with Andreas Hepp, Polity 2016, Media, Society, World, Social Theory and Digital Media Practice, Polity 2012, and Why Voice Matters, which was published by Sage 2010. His latest books are The Cost of Connections with Ulises Meyas, and this published by Stanford University Press 2019. And I think that this talk is very much inspired and based on this latest book, as well as Media, Why It Matters by Polity 2019. And I should say that Professor Couldry is a regular visitor here in Finland and has very good and warm connections with the Finnish academic community. So I'm very, very pleased to welcome you here to give your talk. So please, the stage is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Johanna, for the warm welcome. It's great to be back here in Helsinki. And I just want, before I get on to the main content, to explain a special connection of these ideas to Finland. The first presentation that I gave anywhere in the world after the book, The Cost of Connection, maybe you could just show a copy there. I think my copy is outside. Which was published in August, and you can buy copies in the Academy bookstore. We signed them yesterday. The first presentation I gave anywhere in the world of those ideas when we finished the writing was actually in Tampere in August 2018, hosted by Professor Cornelius. And even more important, the first time where I had the idea privately that led to this whole range of work was preparing for a speech which I gave at the Institute for Advanced Studies, I think in 2015, again hosted by Professor Sumiala. That was the first time that I had the idea of a corporate takeover of the social world. And Professor Nordenstreng was there, Professor Valaskivi and various. That was the beginning of that idea that led to this book. So the ideas do have a special connection with Finland. And it's very nice to return here to develop the argument with you today. Now, I'm not talking here about my ideas. That's very important. What I'm going to be doing is presenting some ideas from, a selection of ideas from a new book, which was very much co-written with my Mexican colleague, Ulises Mejias, who's at State University of New York, who sadly can't be here for this event. So in that sense, it is not a book launch, but you can get access to the book easily after this. So hopefully it will encourage you to buy the book. This was our book, The Costs of Connection, How Data is Colonizing Human Life and Appropriating It for Capitalism, which came out last August. And I want to start with what is the core idea of the book, the core question we try and address in this book, which is really very, very simple. And the question is, what is going on with data? We know something is going on with data. But how should we frame, how should we conceptualize all the new and the not so new things that are going on with big data, artificial intelligence, across business and government, across the whole of society, and now the most intimate details of our individual lives? How do we conceptualize all that? And there are, of course, a lot of ideas which are already available, on the table, if you like. Most of those ideas argue that what's going on is a new capitalism, a new stage of capitalism. And we all are familiar with capitalism. We all know probably we cannot seem to escape from capitalism, since the vision of socialism seemed to die 30 years ago. So this is just another extension of capitalism. And there are variations on this. So there is the idea that this is a digital capitalism, according to Dan Schiller, or an informational capitalism, according to Manuel Castells, Julie Cohen. More interestingly, there's the idea this is a platform capitalism, configured particularly through platforms, from Nick Cernicek. Most famously, there's the idea that this is a surveillance capitalism, from Shoshana Zuboff from the Harvard Business School, her very famous book at the beginning of last year. Or maybe more banally, the idea this is a data capitalism, as suggested in a book on big data 5 years ago by Maya Schoenberger and Ramke, but also, sorry, more recently actually by them, it was their recent book, but they hinted at that already 5 years ago, or Sarah Myers West. Those are lots of ideas, and they seem to cover everything. But Ulises and I felt this is not enough to conceptualize what is going on. We wondered, is it possible that something even larger is going on through everything that is going on with data? Something truly epoch-making. Because after all, a continuation of capitalism in a new form is not really epoch-making, because we know capitalism will continue. Could it be something even bigger? A new phase in the relations between colonialism and capitalism. Relations which, of course, have gone on already for 500 years. Because if we just look back 500 years, it was colonialism that laid the foundations for the very possibility of capitalism. There would be no capitalism if there had not been the original historic colonialism. We get hints of a colonial link in some of today's business cliches. The Economist headline from about 5 years ago, which I'm sure you know, "Data is the new oil." Is this just a harmless metaphor? Or is it something more than that? Is it perhaps an ideology? An ideology that is actually necessary because it makes seem natural what is in fact deeply unnatural. A major new phase in resource appropriation, a historic land grab, if you like, that deserves the name of colonialism. That's the possibility we want to explore in the book. Now, we're not the first people to make a possible connection academically or journalistically to colonialism from data. If we go back to the big scandal of March 2018, the Cambridge Analytica Facebook scandal, And Christopher Wiley was the person who was the whistleblower within Cambridge Analytica, revealing all the plans of Cambridge Analytica to really use Facebook data, psychological data, in effect, to precisely target political messages at particular people in a completely non-transparent way. There was a moment 2 or 3 weeks into the scandal when it was revealed that Cambridge Analytica, which of course now went bankrupt, had plans to expand into India, the world's largest democracy. And he commented on this in Twitter. And I thought his comment was interesting, March the 28th, 2018, because he said, this is what modern colonialism looks like. But the question is, what could that mean? What could it mean to refer to these intimate, but not physically violent processes we're involved in around data as a true colonialism? What could that mean? Well, we argue in the book that what is going on with data is really a new colonialism. It's not just a metaphor. It's not like a sort of colonialism. It's a genuinely new phase of colonialism, which we call data colonialism, that in time, just as the historic colonialism did, will prepare the ground for a new mode of capitalist production that probably we can't fully see yet. After all, original historic capitalism emerged 2 centuries after the emergence of historic colonialism. This data colonialism does not mean there is no legacy of the historic colonialism, of course. That continues, the neo-colonial legacy. That will coexist with this new form of colonialism, if we're right. But what we want to pay attention to is the possibility that we are now in the middle. And everything that's going on and how confusing it is makes sense better if we see it as part of a new phase of colonialism that is starting a new cycle of resource appropriation. I found in German there's a very precise word for this, Landnehmer, the idea of a land grab. There's a new land grab or Landnehmer which will operate alongside of the legacy of the old one that started 500 years ago. You will immediately react against the word colonialism and say, but surely what's going on now with our phones and so on does not match, cannot match the violence, the chaos, the unthinkable violence of historic colonialism. And of course, that's true, for reasons that I'll explain. But at the same time, there are some very deep continuities that we think should alarm us, and that's what our book focuses on. So let's turn now to what is data colonialism in the precise sense in which we use it in the book. Here's our definition. It's an emerging social and economic order for the appropriation of human life so that data can be continuously extracted from it for profit. Let me stay with that for a moment. So I stress for profit. Data can be used for many purposes, including good purposes. I may want more data about my heart rate just for me and my wife, so we know am I healthy or not. Nothing wrong with that. But we're interested here in the extraction of data for profit, but profit can not just mean economic profit. Governments also profit. They get value from the extraction and storing of data from their citizens, and we'll come back to that later on. I say appropriation there, we say appropriation, and there we're drawing on the Marxist concept of the grabbing of resources for some external purpose of capital. And we also draw on David Harvey's piece from about 15 years ago, where he reminds us that the land grab of capitalism doesn't stop with the beginnings of industrial capitalism. It goes on taking new forms. He calls it accumulation by dispossession. And we agree with that. So we're arguing there's a new land grab which makes possible a new capitalism which is occurring right now. And the target of the land grab is not land. It's not what's in the land. It's not the bodies, it's the slaves that worked the land originally. That goes on, of course. It's a new asset, and that asset is us, each of us, in all the depths of our experience. We are the target. And to make sense of that idea that colonialism could not just be continuing, its legacy continuing, but actually taking a radically new form right now, but aimed at a new target, which is us. For that, we need the concept not just of colonialism, but coloniality. This is a concept we take from the great Peruvian sociologist Aníbal Quijano, who was one of the thinkers not of post-colonial thinking, but decolonial thinking, because he argued that beyond the historical, mainly political forms of colonialism, which, thank God, many of them ended about 50, 60 years ago, there's something more enduring, which is coloniality, which is a way of thinking about the world, a way of organizing in the world such that profound inequalities of power can go on persisting and even seem good, even seem necessary and natural. That is coloniality, and we'll come back to that. The idea then is that what is emerging now as part of a continuation of coloniality is a new colonialism whose modes, whose intensities, whose scales, whose detailed contexts are of course different from the historic colonialism of 500 years ago. How could they not be? But the function of this new colonialism remains exactly the same as historic colonialism, which is to dispossess, to grab resources for someone, for some institutions, for some part of the world, away from those whose resources they really are. To dispossess us of control over the stuff from which our freedom is made. And I won't in this talk be saying so much about philosophical ideas of freedom, but as something for you to just think about in the course of the lecture, you might bear in mind that quotation from Hegel, that freedom is the freedom to be with oneself, by Selbstsein, in the other. It's at that deep level we believe freedom is being challenged, where the dispossession is going on. Now, you might be skeptical. You should be skeptical. Particularly of me, a white English person. It would be different if Ulysses from Mexico were here. Maybe that will be more convincing. But me, one of the beneficiaries of historical colonialism, that here am I talking there's a new colonialism. So let me go straight to the conclusion of the book and try and summarize for you what Ulysses and I sincerely believe are the advantages of this approach to understanding everything that is going on with data in a bigger frame. There are two types of advantages we get from this colonial perspective. First is that it expands our scope of thinking. And the other is that it helps us think more deeply about consequences. Let's start with the scope point. The first advantage of a colonial approach is about time scale. So in a colonial time frame, because colonialism in its historic form started 500 years ago, roughly, we are looking on a 500-year time scale and seeing parallels on that time scale. We're not just looking, let's say, over the past 40 years of late capitalism, late modernity. We're not especially looking in the past 10 or 15 years of social media platforms. No, we're drawing parallels over 500 years and suggesting that data is a new historical form of resource extraction that people may be looking back to in 500 years' time, if there is anyone still looking back in 500 years' time. And at that point, they will imagine, where did this latest stage of capitalism come from? It's a historical turning point on that scale, we would argue. The second point in terms of scope is that in a colonial approach, which was the beginnings historically of a new world epoch, which changed the organization of the world and the organization of its resources, the ownership of its resources. It's not enough just to look at social media, which is where the debate stays. It's not even enough just to look at surveillance, which is profoundly important as part of this, we have to look much more widely. We're thinking also about the development of the gig or the sharing economy, as it's called, on Uber, Airbnb, and so on. We're looking at the rise of logistics, which is the fundamental logic of business for 30, 40 years, nothing to do with social media platforms at all, but has been transforming business for 30, 40 years based on a logic of data extraction. We're also looking at internal corporate data. Again, nothing to do with social media platforms or Facebook. And what's quite interesting is that IBM, who are not, as it were, a sexy company, they're not doing so well economically. But what's interesting is they are still a very large company. They're behind a lot of the business platforms we take for granted. And they have a vision which is nothing to do with Facebook's for the era of data colonialism. In their annual report from 3 or 4 years ago, they argued that although everyone thinks that big tech represents the future, big tech platforms, social media platforms, actually their strategy is that the most important data is the 80% of data that remains private within corporations, that can be freely extracted by corporations from the domain they control. And that has an additional resonance because the question is, what is now the data inside a corporation? Well, I don't know if anyone has a smart fridge or a smart lighting system or a smart doorbell. All smart things have one basic property, which is that they convert the data that is part of your life, did you put milk with your tea yesterday or not, into data that is inside the corporation that controls the data flows that drive the policy that you had to click accept to so that your smart fridge really worked. So what is inside a corporation is now what is previously outside, what was inside the flow of our lives. So IBM's vision of the expansion of internal corporate data is actually a vision for the conquest of the human world. It's true that this new type of colonialism is very complex. It may seem much more complex than the original land grab by Spain and Portugal of colonies in Latin America. So there's no doubt that this new colonialism, if it's targeted at human life in general, must not just be external, about distant colonies, it must be internal as well. It's about the citizens within the United States, within Britain, and of course within China. We'll come back to China later. China is an extremely important part of the expansion of data colonialism. So this new colonialism will involve inequality between colonizing societies in some broad sense and the societies such as in Africa, some parts of Latin America, which are particular targets for big corporate strategies of data extraction. China is very active in Africa. Microsoft and Google are very active in Latin America, for example. But it's also, and we'll come back to this in the second half of the talk, a colonialism that is working within even privileged societies, targeting the more vulnerable populations within those societies. So those are three advantages in terms of the scale, the scope of how we think about what is going on with data. But a colonial frame, we argue, also helps us think more deeply about the consequences of what is going on, the sorts of force that are being exercised, the sorts of order that's being built. Because a key part of our argument, and this is a social theoretical point, is that what is being built is a new social order. It's not some isolated acts of corporate appropriation. It is a structured process. This is building a new order. We draw on the thinking of Norbert Elias here, which was important in my last book with Andreas Hepp, that new forms of dependency and rule are developing through data, which are based on some very basic things. Sheer convenience. You must have your phone working. Your fridge, if it's smart, must work. Or customization. You want advertisements that are or products that are somehow fitted to your needs. Personalization is the offer of marketers everywhere today, that the ads you receive are targeted to you and your history. The only problem is that for them to be targeted, the surveillance also has to be equally personalized. It has to be precisely targeted at you. You can't have one without the other. So a new personalized but deeply centralized social order is building. And this, I think, is the most deepest point in our book that came to us as we wrote it. There's a final advantage of thinking colonially about what's going on with data, which is that we finally see that the grandness of the vision of big data, which you read in many, many writers today about how the very basis of human knowledge is being transformed today, the possibilities of the human life are being extended through big data. We can know ourselves better. This idea has a tremendous continuity with the vision of rationality that underlay colonialism itself. Not right at the beginning with the conquistadors. They were not particularly interested in conceptions of rationality. They just wanted the gold. They were prepared to do anything to get the gold. But as the possibility of colonialism emerged and became rationalized, the connections of that to the emergence of Western science became very, very deep. And in fact, the sharpest critics of colonialism and the most intelligent advocates of colonialism say this very clearly. So if we look to Aníbal Quijano, who I mentioned before, he argues that coloniality was only possible with this notion of a deeper West rationality which somehow the West owns and which gives it the right to grab the rest of the world. Someone who liked colonialism, the fascist theorist Carl Schmitt, wrote after the Second World War, when he looked back on what he saw was the failure, the disaster of Nazism. He looked back with great regret on that because he saw it as the end of the colonial international legal order. But he gives an amazingly clear analysis in his book, The Nomads of the Earth, of what that order was based on. And he argues quite explicitly that it was not just about physical violence. It was about justified violence, justified on the basis that the West understood and knew more of what it was taking than those naive little people in the colonies. I can give you detailed quotes. There was a right to take the data, or not the data, the land. But there was also information because of mapping, the origins of the growth of the modern map in colonialism. So there are these very deep parallels, and we would argue, and this will be a difference from Zubov's work, but we greatly admire Shoshana Zuboff for her courage in the book, is that the capitalist analysis cannot get to these deeper colonial resonances of what is going on today. They cannot get us to question the very idea of rationality that makes everything going on with data somehow seem to make sense, somehow seem to be irresistible, somehow seem to be rational, because we all want to be rational. Now, a lot of our book is about historical frameworks, and clearly the book doesn't work unless we can convince you there are some interesting parallels between what we all know today and what went on 500 years ago with the origins of colonialism. So let me give you an example, which was an example that Ulysses imagined and discovered, which was really got us going in the book. We're all very familiar with terms of service in relation to any app, any major platform, Facebook, Google, everything. We always have to accept something if we want those platforms to work. And one example will be Google, Chrome. Most of you, like me, probably use Chrome as a browser. Google Chrome's terms of service, these are not the very latest because they change constantly without us giving our consent. These constantly change. But here's an extract from the Google Chrome terms of service from a little while ago, and just a particular quote. So if you want Chrome to work on your computer, which of course you do, then you give Google a perpetual, irrevocable, worldwide, royalty-free, of course, and non-exclusive license, because after all, there may be other third parties that you don't know that Google wants to use what you give them. To do what? Well, to reproduce, adapt, modify, translate, publish, publicly perform, publicly display, and distribute any content which you submit, post, or display on or through the services. I used to be a lawyer in the dark part of my life, so I appreciate the effort that's gone into that wonderfully world-encompassing definition. And of course, if we want Google Chrome to work, we must click accept, we must install. That is a basic form of operating in our social and economic order today. Could there be a parallel to this in colonial terms? Well, we think there's a rather striking parallel. If we think back to the conquistadors who went into Latin America about 500 years ago, they were armed very early on with a particular document called the Recurring Ento, which in Spanish means the demand. It was invented at the Spanish court to give some rational cover, some legal cover, to what they knew was illegal. After all, these were potential Christians whose gold they were taking, and they knew that might not be right. They debated in the Spanish court for some decades about how to legally rationalize what they were doing. And they came up a document that had to be read out in the middle of the night, 2 or 3 miles outside the village where conquistadors knew there was the gold that they were going to take the next morning. It was read out in Spanish, a language which almost none of the local population understood. They knew that. But this is an extract from what they read out, and we know this because Bartolomé de las Casas, who wrote the great book, The Destruction of the Indies, writes about this a few years later. And here's a quote from the Recurring Ento, that if you, that's the colonized, if you don't submit, I certify to you that, with the help of God, we shall powerfully enter into your country and shall make war against you in all ways and manners that we can, and shall subject you to the yoke and obedience of the church and of their highnesses. We shall take you and your wives and your children, shall make slaves of them, and as such we shall sell and dispose of them as their highnesses may command, and we shall take away your goods and shall do you all the mischief and damage that we can. Except they didn't accept. They did resist for a while, whereas we are used to accepting a similarly comprehensive installation in the fabric of our lives. So let's think about who are the culprits. Who is doing this to us? In the book, we call them the social quantification sector. As I'll come back to later, all of us are in fact involved in building this social order, but there are particular institutions that play a role in leading it, developing it, extending its reach. We call them the social quantification sector. That is the industry sector, and it's very broad, that is devoted to the development of the infrastructure required for data extraction. That obviously includes the big companies. GAFA, Google, Apple, Facebook, Amazon. We should add in Microsoft probably as well. 3 of the world's trillion-dollar companies are included in this. And of course, as you no doubt know, there's a very important Chinese sector, which is maybe not quite so big in terms of stock market valuation, maybe about half the size, but is very, very important. Baidu, the search engine, Alibaba, Tencent, Xiaomi. They are part of the social quantification sector. And a feature of many of these companies is what we call monopoly-monopsony hybrids. So if we think about Google, it obviously has a monopoly of search. It is the most effective and reliable search engine on the planet. And we all need a search engine because we cannot see what is online unless a mechanism helps us search for it, which Google owned and developed. At the same time, Google owns YouTube, which is, if we like cats, we like videos of cats. Most people do. We do a video of our cat. Where do we put it? Well, so that other people who like cats can see it. Where is that? It's probably YouTube. That's where they will find it. So that is not a monopoly of production, but a monopoly of purchase, which in economics is called a monopsony, a one buyer, which structures the space of our production, so that we all produce and send to YouTube or Facebook or Instagram, Pinterest, and so on and so forth. These companies, rather like the East India Company that I benefited from as an English citizen, was both a monopoly of production and a unique buyer of everything sold in India, had to pass through the East India Company so that profit could be extracted before it was sold on. Monopoly hybrids is a specific economic feature they have. But they're not just big players. There are players of any number of sizes part of this sector. Hardware producers, software, little companies developing new apps, new platforms, those who analyze the data, those who broker the data so that it goes on to someone else to analyze. That's the general picture, in other words, of the whole argument we make in the book. I've given you a sort of snapshot in 25 or 30 minutes or so. But my title today, as you will have seen, since it's not a launch of the whole book, I'm making a selection for you from one chapter, chapter 4, which I was particularly involved in writing. And I'm going to focus on the question of the social world. What difference does all of this make, if we're right in our analysis of it, to the world that you and I live in, our interrelations? So the second half of my title today was the hollowing out of the social order. So let's move on to that. What difference would all of this make? What the social quantification sector does for the life we can lead. This is where we get into a dialogue with Karl Marx, Marx's theory of capitalism. Because our book is both a theory of the renewal of colonialism, but a debate and a thinking about how we could understand the new form of capitalism that will emerge through this land grab. And our argument is that we cannot understand what's going on through classic Marxism alone. Because as you will know, classic Marxism, the famous section on the commodity fetish in Capital Volume 1, argued that the social machine of capitalism that makes it real socially is labor relations. The possibility not just of working for someone, but actually exchanging one's work as a commodity with a price in a market, a price that emerges from the possibility that making one sandwich for pret-a-manger has a certain value in a labor market. A price. Clearly, that remains very important. But that is not enough, we argue, to understand what's going on. We need to think about a new type of social relation that could be very important to capitalism as it's emerging today, which is what in the book we call data relations, which simply defined are ways of reproducing or organizing social life, configuring our social interactions for a completely new purpose, a purpose unimaginable 30, 40 years ago, which is to optimize the extraction of data for profit. This is a revision of Marx. It's an extension, I think, of Marx's deepest thinking. And we base that idea on the great Marxist thinker Moishe Postone, who died a year before last, who in an essay from the late 80s called Marxism for a Post-Marxist Age. So he was very concerned that Marxism needs to be creatively extended for a world which doesn't fit with the world that Marx knew, however brilliant Marx was in his predictions for the future. He argues that we need to rethink Marx's social theory of capitalism. And he argues that the most fundamental characteristic of capitalism is not labor relations. And in fact, at the end of the commodity fetish section in Capital, Marx says, I've only just described the way things work now, and that this form of capitalism, it will be different at some future time. But he could not imagine our future. So what's crucial is the commodity, the possibility of commodifying anything. And what explains the possibility of commodifying anything? It is abstraction itself. The possibility of transforming the messy flow, undifferentiated flow of everyday life into something that is definite and clear and bounded enough so that it can be sold as a thing that potentially could have value in a market. Now, it just so happens that this abstraction of life into things is the core of what data is. It is the core of what datafication is. So we think datafication actually fits in the deepest possible way with Marx's insight into what capitalism is and how it works socially, how it reproduces itself. This does have a very disturbing implication, though, that under this model, the problem with data capitalism, if you like, is not that we spend a lot of our time online, sort of working and using our efforts and being not paid for it by Google or Facebook. That may be true, but that's not the deepest problem. The problem is that all of our life, whether we're working or not, even when at last at the end of a long year, I sit down with my family and say, I'm not working today. I'm not working today. But we have a lovely meal with the family. We send pictures to each other to affirm the fact we were not working together and the joy of that. But data can be extracted precisely from that moment. So if we imagine work, and Marxist thinkers have done this for a long while, work is a big domain. It goes well beyond official work, women's work, all sorts of work. But there is always an imaginable domain beyond it which is not work. But the key element of data colonialism and why it's important for a new capitalism is that it capitalizes even that world that is definitely not work. Which means there can be, in the future, nothing outside this enlarged capitalism because of this new land grab. It means that ordinary social life, our life, becomes a direct, as Marx called it, factor of capitalist production. And his examples were seeds, manure from cows, became capitalized and sellable on markets for farmers. They became a factor in production. Human life, our lives, are becoming like that sort of input to the new expanded capitalism. Human life, in other words, is becoming annexed to capitalism. And that involves it being subject to continuous monitoring, continuous influence. We'll come back to that, which threatens the space of the self. And there's a chapter 5 of the book is about the implications of this for freedom. We think they have the deepest implications for the very possibility of freedom. That's where Hegel comes in. Okay, we know this is going on at an abstract level. How does we feel it? Well, we know that every time we want an app to work on our phone, join a platform, set up a smart device in our home, we know we have to accept certain terms and conditions of data extraction. That's a picture of my phone from the end of March 2018, in the middle of the Cambridge Analytical crisis. We were finishing the first draft of our book, and for some reason I deleted Facebook from my phone. It wasn't intentional or political. I just pressed the wrong thing. And I think, oh my God, I must get Facebook back onto the phone because it could be relevant, promoting the book, etc. So I click, let's get it back on, and that's what came up on my phone at that moment. I asked my wife just to take a photograph on her phone of what I was required to accept if I wanted Facebook back on the phone. The whole history of things we know we accept when we want something like Facebook to work. We enter the spiral of data relations. Now, you may be doubtful because you will think, yeah, that is going on. I know it. I don't like it. But it's not violent. It's true. Absolutely no violence is necessary for this act of appropriating my data. I will click accept without any need even for the threat of violence. Why is this? Well, this is because of a very deep difference between this new colonialism and historic colonialism. And the difference is a simple historical one, that our new colonialism, or their new colonialism, which will make possible our new or their new capitalism, builds on already 200 years of capitalism, social relations formed by capitalism. We are all used to signing contracts. We are all used to clicking accept. We are all used to organizing our lives to fit the needs of capitalism. Remember, the original colonialism happened when there were literally no relations of any sort whatsoever between the conquistadors and the populations in Mexico, Peru, and so on. They barely knew each other as human beings, in which circumstance there are only two ways of getting what you want as a conquistador: pure violence and lying, deceit, and they use both. Deceit may be involved today, but violence isn't necessary because we're trained to accept, and we do want the app to work because we're used to living in a world where something like an app working is essential for the convenience of our lives, and we have other things to think about within that world. So no violence is necessary. No violence is necessary to induce us to click accept and so agree to a profound reconfiguration of our life for the extraction of data. So the next question is, what difference does all this make to the social world? The world we share, the world we love together, the world where politics is possible. And this is what chapter 4 of the book tries to think about. And this is where things really get difficult, really complicated. And they get complicated, again, this goes back to a fundamental insight of Karl Marx, which was that profound economic change cannot happen unless there is a social transformation. The economy is already social. It is only social. It's only economists who pretend otherwise. So, and he argued, and this was his theory of the commodity fetish, that you need the mystification so that we think about prices on the market rather than the relations between human beings to have anything like capitalism working. The great economic historian Karl Polanyi, writing half a century later, deepened that insight. When looking back on industrial capitalism, he argued that it was only possible, this emergence of a national industrial economy, in Britain was his main example, but in Germany, Finland, United States, everywhere, it was only possible in a market society. As he wrote, and he was an economic historian, a market economy can only exist in a market society, which has to be created a particular way. It doesn't emerge through magic. It doesn't emerge naturally. It has to be created, as he puts it, through highly artificial stimulants administered to the body social. When I read that a few years ago, it was almost like a shock. I can't imagine a better description of Facebook than that. If you look at it from the outside, ignore Facebook's discourse, a highly artificial stimulant to the body social. In the 19th century, this involved all transactions being turned into something which they didn't used to be. Money transactions. Land suddenly had to be sellable. Every piece of land had a value. Every seed had a value. The manure from your cows wasn't plowed straight back into the land as it had been for millennia. No, it had a value, was sold on to a market, and then the farmers may buy it back in the form of fertilizer on the market. Everything turns into a money transaction. And maybe we could say today that everything is turning into a data transaction. A similarly broad transformation of every social relation into a new form that fits the new economy. And that means there is a very disturbing and deep implication of the data colonialism for the social world, if we're right, which is that human knowledge itself, the way we know the social world, is now completely connected and intertwined with economic profit. We've always known that knowledge, what universities do, books, has an economic value. Of course it does. But that's very different from saying that the mere act of generating knowledge, gathering data, is itself an act of extracting profit, potential profit. That the two are literally the same thing. There is no profit without the extraction of data. But if that's true, and we think it's a necessary part of data colonialism, it sums up the land grab that makes possible a new capitalism, then it would mean that our very possibilities of knowing the social world are themselves already from the beginning poisoned, if you like, tainted by this economic bias influence imperative. But this is, if true, is going to be a very complex change. It's very hard to think about a change in the paradigm of social knowledge. So here in the book, we think a historical parallel is the only way to help us think about such a deep change. We need to compare today's new form of social knowledge with the old form from the mid-19th century that was very important to the social stabilization, and Polanyi writes about this, of industrial capitalism. The old model of social knowledge, which we know because it leads to the sorts of ways of thinking about the social world that were very important for social democracy in Scandinavia and so on, was based around surveys, national censuses, various forms of government-based gathering of information happening occasionally from time to time, censuses every 10 years and so on. There are a few exceptions, but basically the old model of social knowledge was based around publicly funded and publicly collected knowledge about society. Knowledge that was publicly analyzed, debated in public, put to use in public to determine what is the cause of poverty, for example. We get our concept of poverty from the work done on statistics, which were generated by national surveys, which started to see parallels between where people lived physically and whether they were poor or not, and so on. That's where the idea that poverty is not a fate allowed by God, as in the Catholic vision of poverty, but it is something socially caused that came out of a public knowledge generated by governments, debated in public. There were huge debates in the 19th century about whether statistics damaged human freedom, or were they compatible with us being free? Charles Dickens even was involved in the debate about statistics. It was a public debate. This knowledge was publicly accountable. It was challenged in public. Ian Hacking and many others write about this. And it was relatively transparent. It would possible in principle for someone to look at the survey results, look at the questions, test the analysis, come up with a different answer, challenge it therefore. It was relatively transparent. There were many problems with it, but it was that sort of knowledge. The question is, how does this compare with today's new forms of social knowledge? And I think, as you'll realize, there's a very stark difference. Today's new social knowledge, based on big data, machine learning, artificial intelligence, is almost entirely, not completely, perhaps, privately funded, privately collected. It's analyzed privately within corporations, put to use by them, not with our consent, not in ways that we can easily debate, because the debate very often happens within Google. It happens within Facebook. I'm sure they do have intense debates about the ethics of what they do. I'm sure they do. But we're not part of that debate. It's privately accountable and contested. Some people working within Google are trying to challenge that. Some have lost their jobs because they've tried to challenge it, because they want a publicly accountable knowledge from Google. It's absolutely not transparent knowledge. It's opaque. And that's not just because of evil corporations. And let me stress, we are at no point arguing this is about evil corporations. We're talking about the transformation of society, which includes all of us. There's a deep technical reason why this new knowledge cannot be transparent. And that's because it involves machine learning, automated processing of millions of layers of inference in machine learning, the neural net, as it's called, which is, because it's interactive, it is a non-linear form of knowledge. So even the most senior Google engineer cannot tell you exactly how a particular search result was generated. It is not possible. It has to be opaque, and that's the nature of all machine learning. Now, this is developing a vision within corporations about what is going on. You may have heard that a few years ago, Uber, before it became listed on the New York Stock Exchange, already used to talk, jokingly maybe, about its God view of the people using Uber cars. There was a journalist who used to go to parties of Uber in San Francisco. And a year or two later, I think they were nervous about the impacts of revealing this, they told the story of one party where an executive got up and showed the picture of Uber cars driving around San Francisco, the God view. And he said, even for fun, they could switch on de-anonymization. So they could see Nick Couldry going to see that woman the other side of San Francisco another time. Did it last week. Interesting. They could de-anonymize it for fun. Now you might think this is just for fun. They were just relaxing. It's not serious. Well, it is very serious. Because if you accompany another American company less well known called ShotSpotter, which provides data services for the American legal sector, for courts, assesses whether people will reoffend. They developed an algorithm to predict whether someone will reoffend. And they were challenged by the American judge to say, give me the algorithm. I cannot decide the sentence unless I know how you develop that rational process. I represent rationality. I am the judge. The chief executive refused to give access to the algorithm because he said, this is my algorithm. No one can have it except me. And when he was asked by the journalist, he said, you can't have it because it's like taking someone's Netflix subscription. It was his. So knowledge is increasingly taking the form of proxies. But this is a new social knowledge, nonetheless. And it's spreading across the social terrain. Let me give you some examples. Of course, it's core to marketing. You all know that. It's core in the insurance industry, where particularly young drivers are now targeted with cheaper insurance if they include in their car a machine that tracks every move they make in the car. Of course, we know the car is probably tracked anyway now, because that's what a car is. It's a computer. However, a special level of tracking will give them the benefit of lower insurance. And they're young, so otherwise their insurance will be high. Data extraction is fundamental to logistics, as we already said. Management via continuous surveillance is normal to certain forms of lower paid work on the Amazon warehouse floor, Uber drivers, and so on. Even Airbnb is a form of surveillance, some argue, by customers of the people whose property they stay in. The Internet of Things makes no sense because a smart fridge is not more efficient than a non-smart fridge, except as a mechanism to extract data. And it's exactly an example of something bigger that is being talked about in marketing today, called product relationship management, which is the idea that the buying of the object is just the beginning of the data relationship, which continues until the thing stops working, that your use of the object is tracked to give more information to the producer. We are part of this process, those of us who measure ourselves through Fitbit, Apple Watch, and other devices. Maybe that's our choice, but if we go to court, criminal proceeding against us, we won't have any choice of algorithms being used in relation to the way that the court thinks about us, the way those manage crime. Let's think, if these are the new social knowledges emerging, about the knowledges we might be losing. Well, some people, some sociologists in the United States who looked at algorithmic processing in the social services sector argued that we're losing touch of the older idea of poverty as something socially caused. The old rationale that the poor should be given better terms to social services because they're poor, and that is socially caused, is being replaced with a new idea that the terms of credit, lending, and so on, the loans they get, should depend entirely on their prior credit-related behavior. Did they pay back last time? Of course, calculated and processed algorithmically. Others in the United States, where this is very advanced, argue that the decision-making capacity of public servants is being hollowed out because of this new governance by proxy. Rationality is somewhere else. They have to carry out the instructions based on a rationality they don't fully understand, which could have the implication of erasing voice in social knowledge in the long term. And this is spreading across public space in many ways. It's being built into the organization of social space. You may have heard in Toronto, Toronto's waterfront now has based on it Google's Sidewalk Lab, where the whole space is organized around the extraction of data. It is controversial in Canada. Now, this is what's already happening, and it is depressing, but let's look ahead to the future, as imagined by marketers. PricewaterhouseCoopers 5 years ago said, if we could not just track you, but implant something in you that gathers data, which is quite popular, I understand it, in Sweden, then we could tap body cues to tailor messages. If you're thirsty, here's some cheap water at the store around the corner. Great for marketers. Or insurers argue that IoT-enriched relationships would connect holistically to customers, and here's the rub, to influence their behaviors. Last year in the Harvard Business Review, there was a fascinating piece called The Age of Continuous Connection, which argued that all marketing strategy needed to be redesigned in terms of new ways of connecting customers in 4 expanding stages. First of all, respond to desire. Maybe that's old marketing. Then curate the offering so it's already organized so that what people desire is there. Thirdly, coach the behavior so that people are likely to buy what you want them to buy. And finally, automatic execution. No milk in your fridge? Suddenly there is milk in the fridge because they knew you would be needing it this morning, and it got delivered. That is a model in the Harvard Business Review. So this is serious plans. And it is depressing. It does have implications for freedom, as I say there. But how could we resist? Let's end with that, to try and introduce some optimism into the room. What would it be to decline these terms of life? Well, the first thing we have to realize is that all of us have very different stakes in this order. Corporations are differently positioned from governments, from the poor, and so on and so forth. So any form of resistance has to bring people together. It has to be based on solidarity. Otherwise, we are just divided. Rich people, comfortable people will find they get through airports much faster, much better, most of the time. Those who are disadvantaged will suddenly find it difficult, but there won't be a magic social channel between the rich and the poor. So no one will know unless we build knowledge across and think together. Individual subjects will be very differently treated by data colonialism. And the important part of our argument is, although the change is very general, it will be implemented in ways that are profoundly differentiated. And of course, the old social differences, racial, class, economic, don't disappear. They will be reproduced more effectively through this new, more opaque form of social reproduction than they could ever be before. So if we think about resistance, then we need to think about how deep this change is. It is a colonization of space and time. And that means we have to think about reclaiming our space, our time, and insisting they are not empty. They are not just there for the taking. They are not just natural targets of data extraction. They are our space, our time, which means we need to reimagine them, or as the Latin American thinkers against American colonialism argued in the 1970s, we have to reimagine, we have to rename our realities so that we can imagine again appropriating them back. Which means we can learn and should learn from past decolonization struggles. But the core of those was always not just the political struggle, but a struggle to reimagine relations, to reimagine our relations to technology, to find new forms of solidarity, which are hard to build, to challenge and reclaim our common knowledge, which is where our book ends, in a sort of homage to Ivan Illich, the great Mexican thinker of the 1970s and 80s. So the challenge is vast. This is a social order that we're all part of building every time we click accept. That means the starting points for resisting this order of convenience are really not obvious. We have to use our imaginations. And in fact, this is where we end the book. That rather than changes in policy, fixing this or that, renegotiating this or that app, the first and most practical thing we have is our imagination, which is why we believe it's worth trying to write a book about this topic. And it's why I hope it's been interesting to share the ideas with you this morning. Thank you. Thank you very much.
So, thank you so much for this very, very thought-provoking and insightful presentation. Now I'm most pleased to invite Associate Professor Katja Valaskivi, who just moved to the University of Helsinki. So Katja is she's now based in the Faculty of Theology, and her professorship is in the subject area of religion and the digital world, so it covers quite a wide area of issues and things. Professor Valaskivi is a media scholar who has published widely in the issues of digital media, nation branding, and in recent years in particular on violence in hybrid media events. She has directed several interdisciplinary research projects and is currently working on conspiracy theories, darknet, and datafication of violence in society. And her most recent book, co-authored with Anna Rantasila, Mikihito Tanaka, and Risto Kunelius, published by Palgrave 2019, is titled Traces of Fukushima Global Events, Network Media, and Circulating Emotions. Most welcome.
Thank you, Johanna, for the kind introduction. I would like to start by thanking you, Professor Couldry, Nick, if I may.
Of course.
And your absent co-writer, Ulises Mejias, for your work you have done in thinking and writing this book through and writing it into being. It was a pleasure to read it. And I would very much like to thank you for being with us today. We go quite far back together, and we've discussed many of these themes before, so it's lovely to see it come to material. And it is my pleasure to be here with all of you to discuss the book with you, and thank you, Johanna, for the invitation. The book brings us a very useful and comprehensive conceptualization and theoretical understanding of the transformation we are currently experiencing. And there are many directions I could take in this response. What I have chosen to do is to ponder upon some of the implications of what you are saying in your book, and perhaps continuing a bit from where you left off in chapter 4 that you talked about today. So kind of giving glimpses of what's following after chapter 4. So I think this is taking up the challenge you give in your last chapter and also here in your lecture to think together what data colonialism means for human life. And I hope that we can all join the discussion today. My approach is mostly theoretical, and these thoughts are presented to encourage the discussion today. So in your book, you suggest the need to find and use alternative rationalities in countering data colonialism and changing the dominant Western forms of rationalities and epistemologies. And you write about the need of alternative knowledge production, and you encourage studying the social life that cannot be datafied, studying those parts of social life that are unacknowledged and unseen by data capitalism. And you talk about the paranodal. I think that's a nice idea. The paranodal in the sense of things that remain in between, beyond recorded, mapped, and datafied nodes. And this conceptualization actually reminds me of the ideas of feminist theory, looking at in between and betwixt of things that are kind of in our understanding of knowledge. So alternative rationalities, if I understood correctly your book, is that you suggest that the way of studying the part of the social that is paranodal. So I would like to push this a little further even. In addition to looking at alternative rationalities, I suggest as a thought experiment for all of us today So if we push this further beyond rationalities and epistemologies, I would like to ask, isn't the challenge also a question of ontology? Isn't the part of human life that is not, at least not yet, datafiable, more than knowledge and perhaps even predominantly something else than knowledge? For inspiration, I would like to show a short video clip, and I'm sorry there are going to be spoilers. This is from the BBC serial Years and Years, the near future dystopian serial of post-Brexit Britain. And now you have your chance to leave if you don't want to see the very end of the very last episode. So here in this 3-minute clip, one of the central characters, Edith, is terminally ill as a result of the dose of radiation she was exposed to earlier. She has decided to become transhuman. In other words, to upload her full consciousness into a cloud, which is here materialized as water. The treatment is experimental, and it's unclear if the operation is going to be successful. Will she be her once she no longer has her body? Mm-hmm. The family is waiting for the news, and the news will travel through Bethany, the young transhuman family member who has implants in different parts of her body to keep her constantly connected with flows of information. So this clip will take about 2 to 3 minutes, and let me see. And now you need to pause the streaming because this is illegal. Here, love is the answer. But returning to alternative ontologies, I would like to think together today, how does data capitalism challenge our understanding of ourselves as human beings? The answer of Years and Years serial is post-humanist or transhumanist in a way, kind of coming to the same point as you come in your book. That what is challenged is the question of individual autonomy, the essence of self. Will she be herself when she is in the cloud, no longer able to have physical social relationship with family members? She might or might not be her. She could or could not be recognized in the slightly changed voice of the metaphorically named family personal assistant Signor. But at least she's immortal, as long as there is electricity. So there's quite a bit of irony here. What kind of ontology would help us here? For quite a while, the humankind, Homo sapiens, ourselves, we have imagined ourselves as superior to our environment and other species, the ones who are managers of natural resources and utilizes the planet for our own purposes as we please. This is what we call civilization and progress. This civilization, we think, is what separates us from the rest of the inhabitants of the earth. We think of as progress the fact that we have lost the understanding of the material limitations of our actions in relation to the ecosystem that we continue to destroy for our own doom. So perhaps a shift from human superiority to human relationality, as you were saying, is called for. Reimagining relationality and in terms of the ecosystem. So thinking of the human life in relation not only to human beings, but also in relation to other species, perhaps provocatively, I would like to argue perhaps provocatively that as human beings, we don't really understand very well yet the collective biology that binds us together as families, friends, communities, and societies, but also as parts of the ecosystem. The ecosystem, not in a metaphorical sense, like colonialism here is not metaphorical. Much of these much in the core of these relations, I would argue, certainly are things that are paranodal, not datafied, at least not yet, and perhaps not datafiable in their core. So what remains beyond data relations, I would say, is our question today. How would our perspective on data colonialism shift if we would take a planetary perspective? What if the metaphor of data as the new oil is abysmally correct in the environmental sense? And data colonialism is not only about hollowing out the social and threatening human autonomy, with it all its energy consumption and natural resources consumption, isn't data and data colonialism also threatening our existence on the planet? Well, my intention was to bring this onto what we can do and end with an optimistic note. Well, not going to happen, apparently. So it is time for me to stop here and ask Nick what kind of thoughts these ideas inspire, and then open the floor to everybody. What can we do?
So, would you like to have a brief response so
Very
then
brief.
we can open the floor for comments and discussion? Thank you.
Well, thank you, Katja, for a really very eloquent response, the best you've had anywhere in the world. I mean, that was fantastic. I didn't know that serious because I live in post-Brexit Britain, so I don't feel like looking at my future yet, although I know Boris Johnson has plans for me. But that was a tremendous clip, and you went to the core. I could have given a different lecture about the implications for freedom. I've given that in some countries, but chapter 5 of the book is about exactly this. Because if this new order is one that's deeply convenient, if for us as market consumers it works, particularly if we're privileged, maybe we can live with this. If we're not privileged, that's another matter, but maybe we're not one of that group. And we will be divided precisely by data means so that we don't think about that other group. But we do have to think about ourselves as well. And this is our tool to open up a debate with those who are also privileged, who may be troubled by the implications of this. And as we were beginning the book, and I was explaining to Professor Nordenstreng as we walked here, I tried to think, is there any philosopher who went deep enough in defining freedom to help? And I had an instinct it was that impenetrable, impossible philosopher, Hegel. And I searched from what I could find in his commentators on his definition of freedom, and I found it. And it is this, that freedom is the freedom to be with oneself in the other. So there were two radical things about Hegel. First of all, he understood relationality. The first philosopher to understand that we are embedded in a social world, and only because of that do we become selves. But secondly, as an automatic part of his definition that he didn't think much about, he had to say, what is it that we are when we are in the social world? Well, we are with ourselves. And the Germans is, of course, much better because it's by self sign, alongside ourself. When I consider whether I love someone, whether I am grieving for someone, there's no one in between. That is the meaning. But we are letting into that space, exactly as that drama lets out, a possibility of externalization. Yes, we can rehumanize it as they try to do there at the end of the story, and maybe it is okay. Maybe she is still herself, but that is precisely the doubt, that is precisely the space alongside oneself where marketers want to intervene. And if you think I'm being overdramatic, remember a cliche of marketing, which is that they know more about us than we know about ourselves. This is a cliche of marketing, it's a cliche of market psychology, neuromarketing today. The idea is that our memories are fallible, machines can remember. This is a serious discourse in the human sciences, let alone in economics, let alone in biology. This is a rethinking of the very space of the humanities. And my prediction is there won't be a humanities in the sense we now reckon in 20 years' time. because the very nature of social knowledge will be transformed unless we begin to resist, which means we must see this process in full view as an attempt to reoccupy the space of human knowledge and experience for a different end, an end that we did not consent to. And we end the book with helping us imagine the possibility that if we work together and help each other with this redefinition, this renaming of the world, as Paulo Freire called it 40 years ago, conscientization, then we have a possibility of getting to the point where we know we were right to have rejected this. That's what I think we have to do, and thank you for your wonderful response, which put in a much more direct and concentrated form what I was trying to say. So thank you very much. I look forward to your questions.
So who wants to start?
Yeah. So your question was, there are many types of data, which is true. And at a basic level, data can be gathered for good social reasons. Maybe we want to know the cure for cancer. Maybe the only way to cure certain types of cancer is to gather data from all our bodies, process it as humans cannot do through machine learning, share the knowledge, and so on. Iceland agreed to that, actually. The problem was the government didn't ask for their people's consent, but the idea was in principle a good one. So there can be good uses of data. And as you say, we could imagine be good ways of storing data. I'm skeptical about open source because for me, although that was the vision 20, 30 years ago, that if we challenge the Unix system and operate a different code system about the basic operating machinery of everything, we can unlock everything. But that ignores, that's basically a technological determinism, that, not you, but that's the view of those advocates of open source. Because if the real installation is not inside the computer, but into our lives, if it's a social order that's being built, not a computing super hard drive, then open source won't help us. It won't deal with the consequences. So I don't think that gets to it. What we have to do is dismantle the installation in our lives. And that's what we try to begin to think about in the book. That's a great question, thank you. So as I think you picked up, we have a difficult task in this book, which we're trying to say two things at once. That this is a very general transformation, which does affect any one of us. Any one of us could have been on that table, lying there, having externalized our memories. Anyone. And that may be the political route into challenging this if we are within privileged countries that still have a choice. At the same time, number one, any new form of power, data power, will be used to reproduce old forms of inequality. So all the tremendous work in critical data studies in the United States, particularly about how certain data practices reinforce racism because of the nature of the people who work within the industry, that will clearly continue, and it requires a new force. And then there's a geopolitical side to that as well, which is if this is a new order that's being built, not just a technique, and if that order is seen as it is, as essential to the operation of power, and here we don't look at what the American government says, because they will tend to use nice phrases about freedom, free markets. Much better to look at the Chinese government and its policy documents on artificial intelligence and the social credit system. There they make it very, very clear. The goal of extending AI, the reason China wants to be the world leader in AI by 2030 is because they see this as a market improvement of the social and economic order. That's a direct quote from the social credit system policy document, which is available in English as well as Chinese. So it's a market improvement of the order, a form of rule. And that means that form of rule is being used in a sort of spatial way, which plays on the old colonial possibilities. For America, the neo-colonial possibilities. In Africa, Latin America is a very big area of experimentation. For China, new imperial possibilities in Africa and so on, but also, in fact, in Latin America. So you're going to have this complicated layering of neo-colonial underpinning of the new rollout of a new type of colonialism, which we paradoxically are also targets if we look closely. That, however, does give us the opportunity to develop solidarity from where we stand between what we're troubled by and those in other parts of the world who may have very little choice. So Facebook Free Basics, for example, the famous example of giving accessible internet to 23 African countries, builds in it a certain collection of data, which is non-negotiable. It's built into the package of having access to the world. So that's, if you like, a sort of supercharged, unequal data relation, which is built into geopolitics today. So if we, in our privileged position, who can maybe say, well, we'll help each other organize parties without Facebook from now on, we'll do it differently. If we can't feel solidarity with those who have no choice but to accept the Facebook offer, then there's no chance of resisting this whatsoever. Put it another way, if we take a time scale, children are more exposed to this than adults. Children who are growing up today with toys which are robots, which use machine learning to track their speech, to play it back to them, to train them to speak English or Finnish better. I don't know if they're Finnish equivalents or whether you have to buy the English version on the market yet because of other forms of colonialism, I don't know. But these toys exist. If a child now growing up, 3 or 4 years old, has grown up with a surveillance tool as their playmate, as their friend, as the thing, the person, the toy with which they come into the world, then how will I explain to them in 10 or 15 years' time that freedom is the freedom to be with oneself and the other? That will be impossible. So I think we have to operate on a global scale geopolitically. That's why we're traveling a lot around the world to try and share these ideas. But we also have to think urgently. There's about 10 years, I think, to resist this until a new generation comes along that simply will no longer be able to make sense of the idea of being one oneself. And we quote at the beginning of chapter 5 of the book a particularly depressing sentence from a commentator on Hegel, but it's actually very uplifting. This commentator on Hegel, trying to capture the essence of Hegel's thinking, says that the greatest form of unfreedom will be the moment when we can no longer remember what freedom was, what the concept meant. But if that's true, that means we are in a moment, call it 10, 12 years, maybe 20 if we're lucky, where alongside the global environmental crisis and also the massive gender battle, the desire to fight for racial justice, issues of gender justice, which are being reversed by right-wing thinkers, there is this third battle to fight data colonialism. And I see them all as interconnected as part of the struggle today. And we have to start the struggle now. Thank you for your question. Yes. Yeah. Well, that was precisely the idea of that quote from the Harvard Business Review. That last one, automatic execution. We don't need to be consulted about the milk in our fridge. We'd rather just have it brought to us. The decision will have been made for us, but along lines we think. That's a very good question. Digital personal assistants are a very, very important part of it because they are being built into this new order. Again, this sounds scaremongering, but I just read the business press and the business popular books in airports. So if you look at a book from last year called Digital Transformation by Thomas Siebel, one of the main data engineers, really high-end cloud computing designer, top end. His vision of convergence of the digital transformation is super flexible cloud computing, highest level AI and machine learning, and of course the best and deepest possible data extraction. He believes it will deepen markets, but the question is how we resist that. And I think that's a good way in because I don't think the GDPR will be strong enough to resist this. The GDPR is, of course, based around a very important move, though it was, is based around the principle of consent. Did we basically consent? Well, was it informed consent? So that an entity can do what it told us it was going to do. But if what a necessary part of doing what it told us it was going to do is to overlay its intentions on top of ours, which is what you're suggesting is the problem, then unless we challenge the basic concept of that purpose, we will give our consent and we will not be able to challenge it. So a deeper attack is needed on this vision. And I think we need to shift from the model that markets are basically well-intentioned, they move in the right direction. If possible, innovation should be allowed, which is the classic liberal model, to a view that, although that might sometimes be true, under these conditions, it is not helpful because there is, for various reasons, a new way of thinking about human life, which is emerging through market pressures, which is profoundly illiberal, which is profoundly anti-democratic, and must be resisted. In other words, I think we need to learn to help each other, politically, socially, civically, to find ways of saying absolutely no. There are certain aspects of my life which are absolutely not up for grabs, and that includes any assistance watching me as I do what I do, and that no form of convenience will make it anything other than surrendering the freedom we have known until this point. And we certainly should not allow our children to be subject to our choice without even speaking to them. Because that's the other thing the parents are doing today. They are training their children to get used to these assistants without asking the children whether they wanted to be free. Of course, they can't ask them, do they want to be free, because the child does not yet know what freedom is. But it's very important the parents remember what it is. Otherwise, they are imposing that future of non-freedom on their children who they still claim are free. So there are real children, the study on the Internet of toys is perhaps one of the most important ways in, because well-intentioned parents, for the best of reasons, are committing a certain violence on the lives of their children. And I think, again, that it's only the colonial model that gets us to see that. But thank you for your question. It's really the core point.
I'm sure that there are a lot of questions here, but I think it's time to find these cards where you get a discount if you want to buy.
Yes. And the books are in the Academy bookstore, and I signed a few yesterday, if that matters. But maybe it wasn't my robot that signed it, but I actually signed it myself. Thank you very much.